hierarchies are 350 million years old. They're not the patriarchal invention of white European Christian males in the last 300 years. They're 350 million years old. They're stable solutions to this iterated game problem. And they've been around so long that we're actually adapted to them. And that's part of the reason we have archetypal representations of the social structure. And we also have archetypal representations of the relationship of the individual to the social structure. Your job as an individual in relationship to the social structure is to embody the social structure, but also to serve as its eyes and its mouth, so that it can update itself when necessary. So you take on the mantle of your father, let's say, but he's dead. He's the past. He can't see. You can see. So you take the structure that's already there and you modify it where it's necessary. And that modification process is necessary, or the state becomes too static and collapses. And that's why the state has to be subordinate to the individual. And that's what Western culture has discovered. And we can't just let it go. That's the idea of the logos. That's a big idea. And you want to live somewhere where the individual is subordinate to the state. It's like, hey, go right ahead. There's lots of places like that, man. Emigrate. Go there. 90% of the world's countries are like that. If you want to live like that, man, go find out what it's like. You don't see immigration going there, that's for sure. Okay, so that's a big mistake that the postmodernists made. It's not trivial, that's a big mistake, but it's not the only one. Well, here's another one. They don't like inequality. Well, who does? I'm against poverty. You know, that's like classic protest sign. It's like, really? It's like, I'm against torture. It's like, it's so obvious. You don't get any brownie points for being against poverty. No one in their right mind is for poverty. You know, you ever watch The Simpsons? You ever see the Republican Party in The Simpsons? They all meet in an old haunted castle at night with like lightning bolts going off, and there's a vampire and a crazy Texan, and even the Simpson Republicans don't sit around in the haunted tower at midnight saying, hey, we need more poverty. Here's an interesting thing. So one of the postmodernist claims is that diversity is necessary. And they make it racial, and they make it sexual, and they make it ethnic, and all of that. That's actually technically incorrect, by the way, because I study individual differences, so those are the differences between people. And I know the literature, so you know about James Damore's memo, right, from Google. He wrote that partly because he was watching my videos, which is why he wanted me to interview him. And I'm a believer that there are biological differences in temperament between men and women, apart from the other obvious differences, and that they're actually not trivial. And that they maximize in the societies that have moved farthest to producing egalitarian states, the Scandinavian countries, and that the reason for that is that there's two reasons why men and women differ in temperament. One is biological and the other is environmental. And if you remove the environmental variation, which you do if you make the state egalitarian, you maximize the genetic variation. And that's been demonstrated in the scientific literature over about 4 decades. And no one wanted it or hoped for it. And they weren't biased in looking for it, because that was exactly the opposite of what social scientists wanted to find. Because social scientists lean heavily to the left. And what they wanted to find was you flatten out the state so that everyone has equal opportunity and the differences between people disappear. That is not what happened. The opposite happened. That was wrong. And no one was happy about it. And no one's happy about it now. You can actually tell when you've discovered something in a social science, because you're not happy about it. But if you take, let's say, there's a big difference between men and women in terms of trait agreeableness, compassion and politeness. On average, women are more agreeable than men. And the difference is approximately this. If you take random pairs of men and women out of the population, let's say you had to make a bet on who was more agreeable. If you bet that it was the woman, you'd be right 60% of the time. Well, that's not that much. It means you'd be wrong 40% of the time. That's almost 50% of the time. So this is a big difference by social science standards, but that's the magnitude of the difference. There are some differences that are bigger, like the difference between men and women's interest in people versus things is actually bigger than that. That's the biggest difference we know. But it's a big difference, let's say, the agreeableness difference. But still, the shared attributes of men and women far outweigh the attributes that differentiate them. Because you could ask, are there more differences within groups or between them? Now, the postmodern answer to that is between them. That's why you need diversity by group, right? That's why you need different races. That's why you need different ethnicities and sexual preferences and all of that. Well, that's wrong. There's more difference within the groups than there is between them. You don't get diversity by crossing the groups. You get diversity by selecting across individuals. In fact, the idea that there is more differences between groups than there is between individuals is actually the fundamental racist idea. It's the fundamental racist idea, which is, well, let's say you're Asian, Oriental, to use the old word to discriminate the one type of Asian, say, from the other. You're so different from me that there's no overlap between our groups. And you're also so different, and there's so little difference within your group that now that I know that you're not me, you're not one of mine, I actually know what you're like. No. Technically, that's incorrect. That's wrong. That isn't how you get diversity. Now, diversity is actually necessary because people differ in intelligence and they differ in temperament and they differ in skills, and so you actually need diversity because otherwise you can't take advantage of all those differences. So you need diversity, but you need genuine diversity. And like, what would genuine diversity mean? If you're trying to put together a work team, you want people of sufficient diversity so that they more or less, so that you gather together the appropriate talents to produce the implement that's necessary to work properly in the world. That's a competence marker. Because otherwise your business is going to fail. And so the proper diversity with regards to employment is the diversity that meets the requirements of the business, essentially. Obviously. That's why you try to hire people carefully and not randomly, let's say. Third error. First error is there's only a finite number of valid interpretations. Second error is that there are real differences between groups of people, but there's more difference within the groups than between them. Third difference is social status and payment, especially in a free, democratic, capitalist society, is based more on competence than on power. In fact, we would say that when a person in a hierarchy starts to act like their position entitles them to power, then that hierarchy has become corrupt. Harvey Weinstein's a good example of that. I'm serious. It's like he acted like a tyrant. What happened to him? It's not good. Not good for him. What he did was not good. But it's an indication, it's revealed, it's an indication that the misuse. So he's competent, fine, he gets to have position because we need people who are competent. But that doesn't mean you get to turn into a tyrant. If you turn into a tyrant, then that overshadows your competence and out you go. That's the definition of a functioning state. And our state essentially functions. It's not perfect, that's for sure. But compared to what? That's the issue. Compared to your hypothetical Marxist utopia. Well, compared to your hypothetical Marxist utopia, I mean, we're living in Auschwitz, but your actual Marxist utopia is indistinguishable from Auschwitz. So we're not listening to that comparison. We're going to take a look at what we have and we're going to compare it to other places that actually existed in time and geographically. And by those criteria, it's like, is there another time you'd rather live? Is there another place you'd rather live? I mean, a real place in a real time. I mean, you want to live back in 1895, even in the Western world, where the average person lived on less than $1 a day in today's money? You want to live like those coal miners? It's like the answer to that's no. If you have any sense, you should have some gratitude. That's another problem with the postmodern neo-Marxists, like zero gratitude. It's all, oh my God, I'm oppressed. Of course you're oppressed, but you're not oppressed by the patriarchy, for God's sake. So, you have status in a hierarchy. You might say, well, that's like a reward. So you're a high status person. It's a reward. The reward should be shared equally. It's like a badge of merit that you get. It's a privilege. It's not. The reason that in a capitalist society, filthy, selfish capitalists put you in the position so they can extract maximum productivity from you. And that's exactly why you're there. You get paid so you keep working. Why do we want you to work? Because your work is actually valuable to us. And so we're going to pay you so you don't quit. It's not a reward because you're a good guy. It's not a privilege. That's not what it is. You don't hand those things out like merit badges. That's not how it works. The society is set up on selfish principles. We pay people who are competent so they won't stop striving because we want what they can produce. So you don't just distribute that like it's a gift. It's not a gift. It's not a gift at all. So that's another place where they're wrong. Social status and payment is the consequence of the selfish desire of individuals and the group to extract resources of intellect, creativity, and industriousness from those who possess them in excess. Now, of course, it's not 100% like that. There's incompetent people who rise to the top. You can fool people and you can manipulate them and you can act like a tyrant. And, you know, we might say, maybe the system is like 30% warped, something like that. It's not much more than that because we can account for people's success across life by looking at their individual differences, intelligence, conscientiousness, emotional stability, creativity. We can do a pretty good job of predicting their trajectory. So there's error. Some of it's health, right? Because sometimes you've got what you need, but you get cut off at the knees, or your family members do, or, you know, some tragic thing befalls you. There's a randomness in this system that accounts for a fair bit of it. And then there's a certain amount of corruption. Fair enough. But not so much that the lights go off. Okay. What time is it? 8:15. I started when? Sorry, it's been 6:30. I should stop then. I'm supposed to stop pretty soon. I'm going to go for 5 more minutes and then I'll wrap this up. I want to talk about intersectionality and white privilege a bit. So I first said, well, we analyzed Marxism, we analyzed postmodernism. I suggested that postmodernism was a way for the Marxists to keep going under a new guise. I suggested that Marxism was fundamentally based on hatred rather than sympathy and empathy. I suggested that the corpses were the evidence for that. I told you why I think postmodernism is fundamentally wrong. But now I want to talk to you a little bit about white privilege. So, the first thing that and I haven't got this quite figured out yet, I can't quite figure out why the postmodernists have made the canonical distinctions they've made. Race, ethnicity, sexual proclivity, sexual gender identity, let's say. Those are 4 dimensions along which people vary. But there's a very large number of dimensions along which people vary, right? In fact, given that there's an infinite number of ways of interpreting the world, you could immediately point out that there's an infinite number of dimensions along which people vary. And so then the postmodern question is, why would you privilege some of those dimensions over the other? And I would say, well, because it sustains your bloody Marxist interpretation, that's why, but you're not going to say that because it marginalizes, right? You've marginalized that so you can ignore it. So that's one of the fun things about postmodernism. You can I have a very vulgar image in my mind, but, but I won't share that with you, but you can infer it. Here's some ways people differ. Intelligence, temperament, geography, historical time. You live now and not 100 years ago. Attractiveness, that's a big one. That's a big one. Would you imagine you could, we won't go there either. Youth. It's advantageous to be young. You've got potential. It's advantageous to be old. You've got wealth. Health, that's a good one. Sex. Women have advantages. Men have advantages. Maybe one has more than the other. It's not self-evident. Women live about 8 years longer. They're multi-orgasmic. Athleticism, wealth, family structure, friendship, education. Well, then there's the classic, postmodern ones, race, ethnicity, etc. Why not those other dimensions of variation? There's no evidence that they're less important. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that they're more important. So, why not consider them? Then you get intersectionality. This is one of the things that's really comical, I think, because the postmodernists, identity politics types, actually realized this. They thought, well, okay, race and gender. Fair enough. Well, what if you're a black woman? Well, that's a problem because, well, now you've got two dimensions of differentiation. What the hell are we going to do about that? And what if you're gay and black and female? Well, then what if you're not very bright and gay and black and female? And then what if you're ugly and not very bright and gay and black and female? And you can keep playing that game. You can keep playing that game an infinite number of ways, because there's an infinite number of ways to categorize things, as the postmodernists already pointed out. And so the intersectionality theorists came along to plug the hole, but they don't know where they're going. They don't understand that the logical conclusion of intersectionality is individuality. Because there's so many different ways of categorizing people's advantages and disadvantages that if you take that all the way out to the end, you say, well, the individual is the ultimate minority. And that's exactly right, and that's exactly what the West discovered. And, the intersectionalists will get there if they don't kill everyone first. So, on to white privilege. So it's really interesting to find out where these ideas come from. Because usually the scholarship is so awful, you just cannot possibly believe it. It's just absolutely... It wouldn't, at the University of Toronto in the psychology department, the original paper on white privilege wouldn't have received a passing grade for the hypothesis part of an undergraduate honors thesis. Not even close. There's no methodology at all. The person who wrote it, it was called White Privilege and Male Privilege. A personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. Well, first of all, personal account, it's like, sorry, no. So she listed a bunch of ways that she thought, she says, these are personal examples of her unearned privilege, or unearned privilege that she saw as she experienced in the 1970s and 1980s. So this, by the way, this idea is the opinion of one person who wrote one paper that has absolutely no empirical backing whatsoever, which is a set of hypotheses which had never been subject to any statistical analysis. Like, if I ask you a bunch of questions, it's not obvious how many questions I'm asking you, because I could say, how tall are you? Or I could say, if you're laying on the ground, how extended would you be? It's like that, 2 questions? It's like, no, it's 1 question. It's just asked 2 ways. And the way you figure out if you ask someone a bunch of questions, how many questions you're asking them, is by doing something called a factor analysis, which is kind of an elementary form now of social science investigation. If you make a questionnaire, you have to subject it to a factor analysis, because you've got to find out how many questions you're asking. Because you might think it's 60, but it's probably not. It's probably 5. That's the big 5, by the way. Anyways, who cares about that? There's no such thing as methodology anyways. That's all part of the oppressive white male European patriarchy. So we can just not bother with that, and we can pen a few notes about how we think the world is constructed, and then we can screw up the entire political system 2 decades later. Okay, so here's her white privilege list, some of it. There's like 50 things. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. That's actually a wealth thing, by the way. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on my television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. Well, there's 50 of those, I think, something like that. Okay. Is that white privilege, or is that like majority privilege? Is the same true? You go to China, you're Chinese. It's the same true if you're Chinese? Is it majority privilege? And if it's majority privilege, isn't that just part of living within your culture? So let's say you live in your culture, you're privileged as a member of that culture. Well, obviously, that's what the culture is for. That's what it's for. Why would you bother building the damn thing if it didn't accrue benefits to you? Now, you might say, well, one of the consequences is that it accrues fewer benefits to those who aren't in the culture. Yeah, but you can't immediately associate that with race. You can't just do that, say it's white privilege. There's many things it could be. It certainly could be wealth, and the intersectional people have already figured out that there's many things it could be. So, what the hell? Seriously, well, what's going on? Well, we let these pseudo-disciplines into the university because we're stupid and guilty, seriously. And they have no methodological requirements, and plenty of power, and plenty of time to produce nonsensical research, and produce, resentful activists, and now we're bearing the fruits of that. It's not pretty. So white privilege